Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea's consumer prices rise in April by the most in almost 4 years. Inflation at 2.3% for the month, but that level not expected to last all year. New cases of the coronavirus in South Korea topped 500 again on Tuesday, with a growing portion of them being the more contagious variants. And the authorities say South Korea is on schedule to inoculate 13 million people by the end of June, reassuring the public that more doses are on the way and there won't be a shortage. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. We begin with the COVID-19 situation in South Korea. The number of new cases Tuesday was back in the 500s. There's a cluster of infections in the eastern city of Gangneung, prompting the authorities there to strengthen the distancing rules. But the trend recently has seen more cases of the coronavirus variants now, accounting for 14.8% of new infections. Kim Yeon-sung reports.
Coronavirus infections in South Korea bounced back into the 500s on Tuesday, while concerns of variants have also increased. South Korea on Tuesday logged 541 new infections after daily cases had dropped into the 400s on Monday. Of Tuesday's cases, 514 were local infections. The capital area saw the majority of the cases, with 182 local transmissions in Seoul and 117 in the surrounding Gyeonggi-do province. Outside the capital area, the coastal city of Gangneung in Gangwon-do province has decided to raise its social distancing measures to level 2, after 43 foreign workers in the area tested positive. The number of imported cases is also a concern due to the risk of variants entering the country.
The variants make up about 14.8% of the total cases. The percentage has been in double digits for 2 weeks in a row.
In the past week alone, the country has identified 97 variant cases, which brings the total to 632. Most are the UK, South Africa, and Brazil strains, which are even more contagious. Meanwhile, with a number of holidays coming up in May, health authorities warn against family outings due to the risk of infection.
Many people are probably planning to go out or eat out with their children, parents, and extended family members for Children's Day tomorrow and on Parents' Day this weekend. But the risk of infection can come to anyone and at any time.
As the country races towards its goal of herd immunity by November, health authorities say that the vaccination efforts center on not completely eradicating the virus, but on putting the country on track to some sort of normalcy. Kim Yeon-sung, Arirang News.
Tomorrow is a holiday in South Korea, but it'll be a busy day for those working on the vaccine campaign. Around 430,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine are due to arrive. The government's been reassuring people that there's no need to worry about a shortage because there'll also be more doses of AstraZeneca arriving in mid-May. Kim Do-yeon has the details.
There have been concerns that South Korea's vaccine supply is running low, but the authorities say 430,000 doses from Pfizer will be arriving on Wednesday. After this shipment, South Korea will have received more than 2.4 million doses from the company out of the 66 million agreed to under their deals.
With this, 2.4 million Pfizer doses will have arrived out of the 7 million we are due to receive in the first half. The other 4.6 million will come in weekly batches.
Currently, the Pfizer shots are administered to seniors 75 and older, and in June, the plan is to give them to 640,000 essential workers and military personnel younger than 30. As for the AstraZeneca vaccine, new doses are due to start coming in again from May 14th and will be rolled out the very next day to people who need second doses.
AstraZeneca requires a second dose 11 to 12 weeks after the first one. People who have received their first dose on February 26th will get the second one between May 14th and the 21st. We expect around 570,000 people to get their second dose in May.
There are around 350,000 AstraZeneca doses left in the country, and any that remain by mid-May will be used for second doses as well. In total, through the first week of June, nearly 9 million doses of AstraZeneca are due to arrive in South Korea, imported both directly from the makers and the COVAX facility. As for vaccination progress overall, as of Tuesday midnight, South Korea has administered nearly 3.5 million first doses. That accounts for 6.8% of the whole population. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
India has now reported more than 300,000 new cases of the virus every day for almost 2 weeks straight. The country's healthcare system is overwhelmed, running out of hospital beds and oxygen. The South Korean government's already brought back 172 of its citizens from India, and officials say there will be more flights in the coming days. Our Han Sung-woo has more.
India, with 357,229 new COVID-19 cases reported on Tuesday, has now surpassed the 20 million mark in its total infection tally. According to the country's health ministry, the virus has also claimed 3,449 more lives, raising the death toll to over 220,000. But medical experts say actual numbers could be 5 to 10 times higher. Despite a shortage of beds and medical oxygen, new patients are pouring into hospitals throughout the nation, putting India's healthcare system on the brink of collapse. This has led the Indian government to desperately ask for emergency assistance from overseas. A U.S. Air Force aircraft carrying 545 oxygen concentrators arrived in New Delhi on Tuesday, with other nations also providing foreign aid.
We are going to deliver an oxygen production machine that is a very, very important supply to an hospital here in Delhi, in Noida. It will be able to provide oxygen at the same time to 100 patients. That means 1,000 in the period. So it's a very, very important aid from Italy.
Reuters reports that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is reluctant to impose a national lockdown over fears of economic setbacks. Making India's situation worse are problems with vaccine supply and distribution. India is home to the world's biggest producer of vaccines, the Serum Institute, but less than 10% of its population of 1.35 billion has received at least one single dose. Meanwhile, 172 South Koreans in India, including workers from Hyundai Motor Company, arrived at Incheon International Airport Tuesday morning on a special flight back home. They will stay in state-designated accommodation for 7 days and must test negative on the 6th day after arrival before being able to self-isolate at home. Additional tests are also to be taken before leaving self-isolation. Another 211 nationals will return on Friday on a chartered flight by Asiana Airlines. And authorities plan to operate 10 more non-scheduled flights this month to evacuate as many South Koreans out of India as possible. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
South Korea is now seeing inflation pick up as the economy recovers. A year ago, as the pandemic took hold, the country was on the verge of deflation. But in April, consumer prices rose by 2.3%, mainly on more expensive groceries and producers passing down an increase in oil prices. Economists don't think, though, that inflation for the year overall will rise above the Bank of Korea's target of 2%. Kim Sung-min reports.
South Korea's consumer prices jumped 2.3% in April compared to a year earlier, the biggest rise since August 2017. According to Statistics Korea on Tuesday, the consumer price index stood at 107.39 last month. The increase was due largely to a sharp rise in the prices of agricultural, livestock, and fisheries products following the poor harvest and spiking global oil prices. Agricultural, livestock, and fisheries product prices increased by 13.1%, seeing double-digit on-year price hikes for 4 straight months. Of these, agricultural products rose almost 18%, especially green onions, which are now 4 times more expensive than a year ago. The prices of apples and rice saw huge inflation as well. The steep rise in global oil prices was also a huge contributor to the monthly increases, pushing up the prices of industrial goods by 2.3%. Of those, petroleum products saw a bumper 13.4% increase, the highest jump since March 2017. Gasoline prices were up almost 14%. Service prices nudged higher as well, up 1.3% for the year, and part of that was the cost of dining out, which shot up 1.9%. House prices were 1.2% higher than a year ago, the highest jump in more than 3 years.
Statistics Korea added that despite the economic recovery, this month's inflation pressure came more from the shortages in supply rather than increase in demand following improved consumer sentiment. Regarding data coming for May, the agency assumes that inflation will continue as both global and domestic economies are gaining momentum.
Economic sentiment, especially consumer sentiment, is improving at the moment. This leads to increase in both demand and supply. Also, the last year's second quarter inflation rate was very low, so this will bring base effect with the figure expected to see a continuous rise.
However, the agency says inflation is likely to slow down in the second half of the year as the base effect will no longer affect the figure. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
A South Korean government agency has ruled that foreign-born people who give birth in Korea and acquire Korean citizenship after the fact are entitled to maternity payments from the state. The decision came Tuesday from the Central Administrative Appeals Commission. The case was filed by a woman who had been refused maternity benefits from the state because she became a Korean citizen after her child was born. The Appeals Commission, though, reversed that decision, citing her new nationality and the fact that she met the other requirements for the benefits, such as working and paying taxes. This particular benefit is for people who are self-employed and don't have access to employer-provided paternity leave. One of the regions hit hardest in the early days of the pandemic is the state of New York. Now it's going to lift most of its capacity restrictions on businesses, including shops, gyms, and restaurants, starting May 19th. The neighboring states of New Jersey and Connecticut are doing the same. The governors of the three states made the announcement on Monday, citing a steady decline in new cases of the coronavirus and in hospitalizations. The New York City subway will also resume its 24-hour service starting May 17th, having suspended it late at night for a year. These three states will, however, continue to recommend that people keep a distance from each other of 6 feet, which is about 2 meters. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, global strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thank you for coming on.
Good afternoon.
Well, stocks on Wall Street Monday started the week a little mixed. A gain on the Dow and the broader S&P, but tech stocks on the Nasdaq closed lower. Again, it seemed to be strong earnings and a pickup in economic activity, including manufacturing. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, the Dow rose about 0.7% and S&P also gained about 0.3%, but Nasdaq fell by about 0.5%. Clearly underperforming as investors are kind of taking some profit taking on technology shares on the very strong earnings numbers. If you look at the economic front, the U.S. continued to show improvement in overall economic growth rate as the pandemic restrictions are relaxed and vaccine rollout continues. And also, if you look at the 10-year government bond rates, it remains at around 1.6%, which is quite reasonable at the current point in time. If you look at the ISM PMI numbers, it fell below market forecast as the shortages of inputs likely constrain the production. But nevertheless, it's still well above 50 and the economy is expanding. So people are quite well aware that U.S. economy is recovering. And most likely 2021 will be one of the strongest economic growth year that we haven't seen in the past several years. And that is putting some positive indication for the equity market movement. And also, if you look at the U.S. dollar index, it remains to be quite steady as the economy is improving. And the overall, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, as well as the Joe Biden, all talk about the boosting measures. And in terms of the tapering, it's unlikely that it's going to come anytime soon. So overall, economic numbers are good. Liquidity conditions good. Just now, because the market has risen so fast that people are taking some profits. But in a longer-term basis, I think that market will continue to go up higher in the future.
Yeah, we saw it go up around 5% just last month. And today here in Korea is a rather choppy session in the Korean market. It was, of course, the second day since regulators lifted the ban on short selling that had been in place since early in the pandemic. Yesterday, the KOSDAQ, which lists tech companies, significantly underperformed the KOSPI, but not really the case today. Are fears overblown about short selling on the KOSDAQ, or what's your view?
Sure. I think the removing of short selling is because the economy is improving. If you look at the overall earnings numbers for KOSPI and KOSDAQ, we are looking at one of the highest growth rate, well above 40% year on year for this year. That is much stronger than most of other countries, and economic growth rate is recovering quite nicely. So therefore, we have seen KOSPI rebounded by 0.64%, KOSDAQ rebounded by 0.56% today. After in the morning, we actually sharply fell by close to 1% plus. Now, if you look at the overall PMI numbers, it came in at slightly below expectation, and it declined to 54.6 in April. But nevertheless, once again, is well above 50 range, meaning that the manufacturing sector is quite expanding, and the health of the manufacturing sector looks very positive. So we think that the Korean equity market will have some more room to go up as the economy recovers and the manufacturing sector strengthens.
And at the close, the KOSPI and the KOSDAQ both up today. But looking at the bigger picture, you mentioned room to grow. Valuations in Korea are still much lower than in the bigger markets. Price to earnings in Korea at 26 versus about 34 in the U.S. So tell us about today's trade and your outlook going forward.
Sure. As I said, the PMI numbers are coming in at 3-month low, but nevertheless, it is expanding. And also, if you look at the South Korea's export numbers, it looks very strong, and it is rising by 41.1% year on year in April 21. Clearly, this is a much faster pace of growth that we've seen in March relative to March. And this kind of rise is actually quite strong relative to any other countries. That's because Korea is highly skewed towards the economic growth rate of global scale. Global economy recovers, then Korea export recovers, and Korean economy recovers. Yes, we do have concern about the consumer debt level in Korea. However, as long as the interest rate remains low with the low inflation pressure that we are seeing, we think that the continued valuation attractiveness is going to spur into the equity rise in the longer-term futures. If you look at the P multiples and the price to book and return on equity improvement, all looks very positive that Korea looks the cheapest in a relative to any other countries in the world.
And finally, Mr. Yu, we see consumer inflation or consumer prices in Korea rising by the most in almost 4 years last month on year. For a long time, we were getting close to zero on that figure. So what do you make of this inflation number?
Right. I mean, as you know, the March number and April numbers probably one of the weakest in last year. So YOI numbers obviously is going to be stronger than expected, and it came in at about 2.3% in April. And it risen from 1.5% in the month before, and beating the market estimation of 2.2% slightly. If you look at the overall rise in inflation, it comes from the restaurants and hotels, the transports, and also the food and beverages side also showed a very strong number as well, but slightly less than the previous month. All in all, the consumer price is climbing quite nicely because of the global economic recovery that fitting into Korean economy as well. However, though, if we look into longer-term futures, we don't think that inflation pressure is going to be any significant in a global scale or a Korean scale. That the overall consumer's debt level is an issue, and also the unemployment issue is continuing to remain quite high, and also the salary increase is going to be quite timid, and also labor participation ratio is going to be quite timid as well in a global scale. So all that means is that inflation is going to be quite timid, and which means that we are looking at Goldilocks era where inflation remains quite reasonable and economic growth rate recovering. That is definitely positive news for Korean equity market and global equity market.
Got it. All right, Mr. Yu, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. As always, we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Foreign ministers from around the world are gathering in London for the G7 Foreign and Development Ministers meeting. This two-day in-person meeting is the first of its kind in almost 2 years. In addition to the G7 members, also invited this year are South Korea, India, South Africa, and Brunei, which is representing ASEAN. This is South Korea's first time at the G7. The ministers there will be discussing geopolitical issues, including the protection of democracy, freedom, and human rights. Also on the agenda are relations with Russia, China, and Iran, as well as the turmoil in Myanmar and in Syria. They'll also discuss vaccines, climate change, and gender equality. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says it's up to North Korea now to decide whether or not it wants to engage diplomatically. The regime has recently had some harsh words for Washington, but the Biden administration has clarified that it does want to engage. Blinken was in London for the G7 meeting, where he emphasized the importance of joint efforts on that front. Kim Hyo-sun reports.
America's top diplomat explained that the diplomatic ball is now in North Korea's court, stressing that the Biden administration is focusing on a practical approach that will explore diplomacy with the regime.
I hope that North Korea will take the opportunity to engage diplomatically and to see if there are ways to move forward toward the objective of complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And so we'll look to see not only what North Korea says, but what it actually does in the coming days and months. But we have, I think, a very clear policy that centers on diplomacy, and it is, I think, up to North Korea to decide whether it wants to engage or not on that basis.
The remarks during a joint press conference Monday with his British counterpart in London, where he's attending the G7 Foreign and Development Ministers meeting, come after Pyongyang threatened Washington that it will face a, quote, worse and worse crisis. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also underscored the need for regional cooperation in dealing with the North in his bilateral meeting with South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong, held on the sidelines of the G7 talks. The two allies discussed the conclusion of Washington's extensive North Korea policy review, which Chung welcomed. Following the meeting, Seoul's top diplomat told Yonhap News Agency that the two allies will exchange more views during trilateral talks between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S., likely to be held on Wednesday. Chung is currently taking part in the G7 meeting as a special guest, along with ministers from Australia, India, South Africa, and Brunei. Meanwhile, Blinken also sat down with a Japanese counterpart and again stressed the importance of regional cooperation to denuclearize North Korea. The two foreign ministers shared concerns about the North nuclear and ballistic missile programs, while reaffirming their commitment to tackling the issue through trilateral cooperation, also involving Seoul. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
In late March, the Seoul Fashion Week for fall and winter was held online. And in just a month, videos from the event have gotten more than 4.7 million views across various online video platforms. That's about 4 times more than Fashion Week last autumn, which was also held online. On YouTube, the show's gotten around 228,000 views, more than half of them from other countries, including the U.S. and Indonesia. A Seoul city official said K-fashion is trending globally and noted that foreign media like Vogue and Forbes have also reported on the event. In the pandemic, the city of Seoul has been trying to support the Korean fashion industry by helping designers connect to the global market. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.